They didn't shout in the orphanage. They didn't beat. They didn't lock children in dark rooms with mold on the walls and rats scratching in the corners. The punishment was quieter, cleaner, more terrifying. Silence. Thick, like fog that refuses to lift even at noon when the sun tries to break through dirty windows. The institution was officially called Harmony, but all the children whispered among themselves, the silent one. Here words were a privilege that could be lost in a single second. And silence became a whip that struck the soul without leaving marks on the skin. If a child misbehaved, asked why the soup had no salt today, or cried from stomach pain, or simply looked a caregiver in the eye for longer than a second, they were switched off. Noticed no more, heard no more. Caregivers walked past, as if past an empty space. Other children received the order, written on the dining hall blackboard, "Do not speak to number 19. Do not look. Do not help." And they obeyed. Not a word. Not a glance. Not a hand extended when you stumbled from weakness. Even if you coughed blood or lay curled on the floor from hunger, the silence continued. Days blurred into weeks. Sometimes a month. Silence didn't break the body. It erased you from the world of the living while you were still breathing. She was number 19. Once she had a name, Masha. But names here were erased slowly, like chalk from a board. First they forbade saying them aloud, then thinking them before sleep, and eventually they simply faded from memory, becoming foreign, distant, like photographs of people you never knew. Her crime was simple and foolish. She asked the caregiver why the sky outside the window was always gray, even when it wasn't raining. The caregiver smiled, coldly, the way people smile who have long forgotten what warmth feels like. She said quietly, "You shouldn't ask." And the silence began. 29 days. She sat in the corner of the dining hall, but no plate was placed in front of her. She slept on a hard cot, but no one turned off the corridor light. No one wished her good night. She walked the hallways, but her footsteps echoed only inside her head. Children averted their eyes. Caregivers looked straight through her as if through glass. She felt something inside her cracking, slowly, soundlessly, like ice underfoot in early spring. One more day, and she would break completely, not cry, not scream, simply cease to exist. Become part of that silence. The night came quietly, as always. The moon shone through the bars, thin as a shard of glass. She stood up, not planned. She simply walked to the window at the end of the corridor where one bar had rusted loose long ago. She pushed, climbed, fell into prickly grass, scraping her knees and palms, stood up, ran. Across the yard, over the low fence topped with barbed wire, through the field wet with dew and night rain. Her lungs burned. Her feet sank into mud, but she ran. The silence of the orphanage stayed behind, but its echo still rang in her ears, like a distant bell that never stops. The road appeared suddenly, an old asphalt strip, cracked from time and frost. She walked along it barefoot, shivering from cold and fear. Headlights flashed in the distance. The car stopped. The door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, in an old jacket with worn elbows, face furrowed with wrinkles like an old, forgotten map. He looked at her, Didn't startle, asked nothing. Simply said quietly, without pressure, "Get in. You'll freeze." She stood, expecting an order, a trap, a new silence. But he simply waited, didn't demand, didn't pull her by the hand. When she finally climbed into the passenger seat, he closed the hood, started the engine, and drove. No words, no accusing glance. Just drove into the night while the headlights carved wet asphalt and bare branches out of the darkness. The road wound through the forest, dark, dense, smelling of wet pine and rotting leaves. Headlights snatched tree trunks glistening from rain, and occasionally the eyes of some animal in the bushes. She sat pressed against the door, feeling the warmth from the heater slowly chase away the chill. Fear didn't leave. It sat inside like a lump she couldn't swallow. Who was he? What awaited? In the orphanage they taught, the world outside is chaos where silence is rare, but punishments are worse. She waited for questions. "Where are you from? Why barefoot? Who's looking for you?" But he was silent, only occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, not at her, at the road behind, as if checking whether anyone followed. The house appeared unexpectedly, old, wooden, on the edge of a small village where window lights were rare as stars on a cloudy night. The veranda creaked underfoot. The roof sagged slightly from past winter's snow. The door opened without a lock. He simply pushed it with his shoulder. Inside smelled of wood, stove smoke, and something warm and homely. Soup, probably, or freshly baked bread. He turned on the light. Dim, yellow from an old lamp under a shade. Showed her the room at the end of the corridor, small, with an iron bed covered by a faded flowered blanket, and a window looking out onto a dark garden. "Sleep here. Clothes in the wardrobe. Food in the kitchen. Take whatever you want." His voice was quiet, emotionless, expecting no reply. He turned and went to his room. The door closed softly, without a slam. She stood in the middle of the room, looking around. Walls bare but clean, no graffiti or nail scratches. The wardrobe was old but inside. A gray wool sweater, warm pants, thick socks, everything oversized but soft. She changed with trembling hands, feeling fabric against skin for the first time in years. Went to the kitchen barefoot. Floorboards creaked under her feet. The refrigerator hummed softly like an old cat. Inside, bread, cheese, apples, a bottle of milk. She took an apple, red, with a tiny worm track near the stem, bit into it. Juice splashed on her lips, sour sweet, real. In the orphanage, fruit was a rarity. Here they simply lay as if waiting for her. The night passed restlessly. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, listening to the house's silence. But this silence was different. Not punishment, just absence of noise. Floorboards creaking from wind, wall clock ticking, leaves rustling outside the window, not emptiness. She waited for him to enter, demand explanations, begin to ignore her, but the door stayed closed. In the morning, she heard footsteps in the kitchen, smelled coffee. She came out and stood in the doorway, not daring to enter. He poured 2 mugs, set one on the table, didn't say sit. Just nodded toward the chair. She sat. Sipped slowly, feeling warmth in her palms and throat. He ate bread with cheese, not looking at her. Then stood, put on his jacket. "I'm going to the workshop. Back by lunch," and left. No order, no question. She was alone in the house. For the first time in years. Alone, but not invisible. She walked through the rooms, touched things. Books on the shelf covered with thin dust, old photographs in frames. A younger man with a woman and a little girl. Tools on the workbench in the shed. Everything felt foreign, but not hostile. She waited for the catch. In the orphanage, they taught, nothing is given for free. But here, no one demanded anything. He returned in the afternoon, brought food, potatoes, carrots, onions, cooked soup, simple, thick, smelling of dill. Set a bowl in front of her. Didn't ask if she had eaten, just ate his portion. In the evening, he sat by the stove with a book. She sat opposite, staring into the fire. The silence didn't press. It simply was. Days began to flow slowly, like a river edging toward winter. She expected the silence to return, the kind from the shelter, the kind that breaks you. But here the silence was different. It did not punish, did not erase. It simply existed. He expected nothing from her. He did not demand words, did not force her to work, did not ask about her past. He simply lived his life, giving her space within it. In the mornings he went to the workshop behind the house, fixing old machines the neighbors brought. A tractor with a fallen wheel, a motorcycle with a punctured tank, a truck with a dead engine. The sound of a hammer, the scrape of metal, the smell of gasoline and oil, these were the first noises she heard without fear. She stayed in the house. At first she just sat, staring out the window, watching leaves fall, birds land on branches, the neighbor's cat walking along the shed roof. Then she began going out into the garden, small, overgrown with weeds, but with apple trees and an old cherry tree. She gathered fallen apples, ate them in secret, like treasures. The skin was rough, the flesh sweet with a bite of sourness. One day, she washed the dishes after lunch. He saw it and nodded. He didn't say thank you, didn't say do it again, just went into the room. The next day, she swept the floor. He noticed but said nothing. She waited for reproach. In the shelter, any action without permission was punished with silence. But here, nothing happened. Nights were heavy. Dreams of the shelter came often. Endless corridors where no one looks, no one hears. Only a clock ticking, like a heart about to stop. She woke drenched in sweat, sat on the bed, hugging her knees. Once she went into the kitchen. He was there, under the lamp with a mug of tea. He looked up. "Can't sleep?" His voice was quiet, without judgment. She nodded. He poured tea and set it in front of her, sat across from her, silent. But the silence wasn't empty. It invited. She could speak or not. She chose silence. But the next time she whispered, "My name is Masha." He nodded. "That's a good name." Nothing more. He didn't ask where she was from. Didn't ask why she whispered. She began helping more. Watered the garden, cleaned vegetables for soup, washed the windows. He showed her how to sharpen a knife, once, without words. Then he left. She tried on her own, cut herself. He saw, brought a bandage. Didn't say, "Be careful," just wrap the wound. Winter came quietly with the first snow. The house grew warmer from the stove. She sat by the fire for hours, feeling the heat on her skin. He read books, old, worn with yellowed pages. One day she took one. He didn't object. She read slowly. The words felt foreign after years of silence. But they returned. She began to understand that the shelter's silence was retreating, like a shadow from light. But fear remained. What if he gets tired of her? What if he starts to withdraw? What if he says, "Leave"? But he expected nothing. He simply was. Spring arrived with melting snow and the smell of wet earth. She planted seeds, potatoes, carrots, dill. He showed her how to dig the beds, silently, with a single motion. She repeated it. The soil beneath her hands was cold but alive. For the first time in years, she felt something growing under her hands, without breaking, without disappearing. The days grew longer. She went into the village with him to buy supplies. People stared, whispered, "Who's that girl with the old man?" He didn't explain, just bought bread, milk, grain. She carried the bag. No one questioned her. But she heard the words, the first words from strangers that didn't punish. One day the local officer came, knocked on the door, asked, "Girl from the shelter? They're looking for a runaway." He stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "No such girl here." The officer looked at her. She was sitting on the veranda, a book in her hands. Their eyes met. She didn't look away, didn't hide. "If you see her, report it." "I will." The door closed. She waited all night, waited for him to say, "You have to go back." Waited for silence. But in the morning he put the kettle on, as always. Said, "Today we'll plant herbs. Will you help?" She nodded. The fear stepped a little farther back. Summer brought heat and dust. The garden bloomed. Vegetables, berries, flowers she planted simply because she wanted to. She harvested, made jam, dried herbs. He fixed the fence, reinforced the veranda, showed her how to use tools, silently, by example. She learned, cut herself again. He bandaged it, didn't scold. Nights grew warmer. Dreams of the shelter came less often. One evening she told him, whispering by the stove, about the silence that breaks you, about her fear of becoming nothing. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't pity her, just nodded at the end. It won't happen again. She believed him. She grew, got taller. Her eyes came alive, learned to laugh, quietly, but from the heart. Learned to argue, rarely, but when needed. He didn't get angry, just answered if she asked. He expected nothing, didn't demand gratitude, didn't tell her who to be, just gave space. And within that space, she grew. Autumn arrived with golden leaves and cold winds. The garden gave its harvest, modest, but theirs. They dried apples, salted cucumbers, stacked firewood. The house grew cozier. She hung curtains from old fabric. He fixed the stove, put in a new kettle. Small changes, but they made the world theirs. Rumors came from the village. The shelter was searching for runaways more actively. Someone had seen patrols on the roads. She expected fear to return, but it was weaker. One night she heard footsteps beyond the fence. She got up, grabbed a knife from the kitchen. He was already awake, a rifle in his hands, old but reliable. They went out together. In the darkness stood a man in uniform from the shelter. "The girl is here. We know." He stepped in front of her. "Leave." The man smirked. "She's ours. Number 19. She stepped out of the shadows. "My name is Masha." Her voice was steady, not a whisper. The man in uniform backed away, left muttering threats. But he didn't return. After that, she changed, became braver, spoke more, asked about his past, quietly, without pressing. He answered briefly. Lost his wife and daughter in an accident 10 years ago. Lives alone. Expects nothing from the world. Just fixes machines and breathes. Winter came again. Snow covered everything in white. They sat by the stove. She took an old notebook, began to write. About the shelter, about silence, about her fear of becoming nothing, about how silence here had become something else, a space where you can breathe. He watched, didn't ask. She understood. Here, silence was not a weapon. It was a choice. After that night, the house seemed to grow quieter, not emptier, deeper, as if the walls had heard her voice and remembered it. She caught herself no longer flinching at every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the slam of a door, the wind howling in the chimney, none of it felt like danger anymore. They were simply the sounds of life. She was alone more often. He went to the neighbors to help with machinery, to fix, to carry, to replace. Sometimes he was gone all day. Before, those hours would have stretched endlessly. Now they passed. She found ways to keep her hands busy, mending clothes, sorting grain, arranging tools in the workshop. The way she thought made sense, not because she had to, because she wanted to. She began going farther than the garden, first to the edge of the field, then to the river. She would sit on the bank, watching the water slowly carry leaves away. Sometimes she took the notebook with her. She wrote unevenly, with pauses. Not always in words, sometimes just lines, as if testing whether her hand would obey. Her thoughts no longer scattered. They waited. She found herself thinking more and more about the word later. Before, it hadn't existed. There had only been now and survive. Now later appeared, quiet, uncertain, but alive. Later the road, later the city, later people who didn't know her story, later questions she would have to answer. She imagined it without terror, carefully, but without panic. Sometimes she caught his gaze. He didn't look at her like a guard or like an owner. He looked like someone who recognized another person's right to exist. It was strange and difficult. At the shelter, any attention was either control or indifference. Here, it was simply presence. One evening she asked, "Aren't you afraid I'll leave?" He didn't answer right away. He added wood to the stove. Watch the fire. To be afraid means to hold on, he said, and I don't hold on. She nodded. The answer was simple, but something shifted inside her. She understood. She wasn't being tested, not measured, not pushed toward the right decision. Here, mistakes were allowed. Leaving was allowed. Staying was allowed. And none of it turned into punishment. She slept more peacefully. Her dreams changed. The corridors disappeared. Sometimes she dreamed of the house, empty, flooded with light. Sometimes of the road, sometimes of nothing at all, and that nothing no longer frightened her. One day she realized she could call this place home, not out loud, to herself. The words settled easily, without resistance, and immediately another question followed. If this was home, did that mean she had to stay forever? There was no answer, and for the first time, that was okay. She began preparing for leaving, not as an escape, but as a possibility. In her mind, she made a list of the things she would take with her, not because she planned to leave tomorrow, but because she wanted to know she could. And that was when she understood. The fear hadn't faded because the world had become safe. It faded because she had been given the right to choose. Spring returned with shoots and the smell of wet earth. She packed her things into an old bag, a sweater from him, the knife she had learned to sharpen, the notebook with her writing, a few apples from the garden. She stepped onto the veranda. He was sitting on the steps, fixing an old carburetor. "I can leave." He looked up, calmly, without surprise, without resentment. "You can." The bag pulled at her shoulder. The outside world beckoned. Roads, cities, people, noise she had almost forgotten. But inside her, something new was growing. Not fear, not obligation, choice. She stood there a long time, listening to the wind in the leaves, a distant dog barking, the clock ticking inside the house. Then she set the bag down, sat beside him. "And can I stay?" He was silent, looked at her long and carefully, then nodded. "You can." She took the screwdriver from his hands, began to help. The silence was warm, their silence. She stayed, not out of fear, not out of duty, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time in her life, she made the choice herself. Another year passed. The garden bloomed fuller. The house became a real home, with curtains, shelves of books, the smell of fresh bread she had learned to bake. Sometimes others came, runaways from the shelter, tired, frightened. They gave them shelter for a night or two, food, advice. But they didn't keep them. Everyone chose for themselves. She wrote the last line in her notebook. "Silence is not a punishment. It is a space where you can hear yourself and choose to stay." They lived quietly, but together. And that turned out to be enough.